Welcome to African Black Psychology in the American context. As we begin discussions on Chapter 3, which is a part of Unit 2. In this chapter, we discuss worldviews and worldview paradigm in African Black psychology. We've discussed this concept of worldview and identified the differentiation between the African worldview and the European worldview. Diop identified that there are two differences, or what he identified as the two cradle theory, expressing there are two differences between the southern cradle, that of Africa, and the northern cradle, that of Europe. In the southern cradle, the environments are warm, abundant, and in the northern cradle, it's cold and hostile. So he argued, Diop argued that the behaviors from the northern cradle and southern cradle are distinctly different, and they reflect the region or the environment in which the person evolved in. So the European, coming from the northern cradle, cold, hostile environment, reflects individuality, difference, competition, survival of the fittest, whereas the African, coming from the southern cradle, reflect interdependence, survival of the group or the tribe or the nation, groupness, sameness, and commonality. So if we think about this concept of worldview, how African people view the world and how European people view the world are considered distinctly different. But based on Diop's theory, he argues that it's connected directly to the cradle in which the person evolved from. He also identifies that it can be broken down into the things associated with how they worship gods, deities, the succession of the line, and their lifestyles. So from the northern cradle, there is a nomadic culture where it follows the father's line. The wife loses any legal rights, and the inheritance comes from the family. The wife cannot divorce, and the woman brings the dowry. It also emphasizes individualism, as I mentioned earlier, and xenophobic uninterest or dislike of people. Whereas in the agrarian sedentary society, it follows the matrilineage. The wife keeps the name. The inheritance comes from the uncle. The wife can divorce. The man brings a dowry. In this cultural framework, what is valued is children, because women can give birth to children. The idea of the man bringing the dowry is in giving thanks for the woman being able to procreate. There is no notion of the original sin in the African northern cradle, whereas there is a notion of the original sin, and the sin is the fault of the woman. So there is essentially embedded in the cultural worldview a devaluing of the woman. And African worldview, African cosmology, in the southern cradle, land is collective. Property is not owned, it's owned by all. And the value is placed in raising children. Whereas in the northern cradle, excess babies are killed and land is private, and it is an emphasis on individualism. So the African worldview and the European worldview are distinctly different. And there's what is known as a war of irreconcilable differences, given the racial pluralism and so-called multicultural nature of American society. That pluralism tends to push Eurocentric or European worldviews, whereas the African, they're just distinct cultural differences. So there's this inevitable conflict that exists between these oppositional worldview systems. One that emphasizes collectivism and survival of the group is directly in contrast with or conflict with when it emphasizes the survival of the individual or survival of the fittest. That is the war of irreconcilable cultural differences as it relates to the worldview. So again, we're going to take a look at this worldview schematic that breaks down the European ethos, values, or the ethos of the African and European values and customs and psycho-behavioral modalities. We always emphasize this notion of individualism from the European worldview versus groupness from the African worldview. And again, this is associated with the foundations of the differentiation between the Southern and the Northern cradle. The groupness, again, follows that Southern cradle. And one of the ways I identify it is if you consider an environment that is of abundance, where the temperature is warm, you grow food and have food in abundance, you're more likely to share. If you have to fight and scrap for food, then you're more likely to not share and actually fight over food. So the Southern cradle had abundance, whereas the Northern cradle with cold, hostile environment did not have an abundance of food or resources and things like that. Therefore, it caused individuals to take on a competitive nature, separateness, and independence, and emphasize materialism and ordinality, whereas the African worldview emphasizes collective cooperation, interdependence, complementarity, and groupness. So we want to take a look at examples of manifestations of the worldview among Africans in America. So far, we've differentiated African worldview versus the European worldview. And later on in the course, we'll talk about the European psyche. And then after that, we'll break down the African psyche. But we want to look at what does it mean to act like an African inside an African worldview lens that emphasizes an African survival thrust. And remember, I use Black African interchangeably. So in this section, we're going to look at manifestations of the African worldview among Africans in America. So when an African person operates inside the African worldview, it means they're operating inside their African mind. And inside of that, these are carryovers because remember, Africans in America were taken and stolen. We are in comfortable captivity, have not been returned to Africa. So all the behaviors that we have Africans reflect that are inside the African worldview are innate behaviors that come from just knowing who you are. So the first example is extended kinship and family. In most environments, people have your regular old family. You have your cousins, but then you have your play cousins. You have your sister, but then you have your sisters. So you have your brothers, but you got your brother. And again, there is this idea that family is the biological family, but then there is extended kinship where we adopt and take on, or informal adoptions where we take on sisters, etc. And we also have and emphasize this notion of family reunions and making sure that we stay connected as family. In this manifestation of the African worldview among Africans in America, also in that extended kinship family perspective, there's a strong reverence for children and the elderly. That's very consistent with African worldview paradigm. The reverence for the children and the elderly are reflected in how children are loved and appreciated, and the elderly, as much as possible, stay in the home with the family. Very different from other worldview perspectives. With the European worldview perspective, religion and religious expression and practices, there's a recognition and acknowledgement of God, the supreme being, and the creator as a regular part of every activity. Even at the family reunion, there's prayer before the food. There's prayer and various different things. One cultural carryover we talked about is what Marimba Ani identified in her book, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, how when African people drink alcohol, the homies on the corner, what do? They tap the bottle and then pour out a little liquor for what? That's right, the dead homies. In doing so, pouring out a little liquor for the dead homies, that's a cultural carryover. And that's spiritual in nature. That is connecting to this notion of libation, a prayer that is poured everywhere in Africa before major events. So African people still have a strong sense of morality. They believe in the spiritual presence in everything. And that also leads to a strong sense of ethics as it relates to all human activities. Human relationships, very highly ethical, highly moral. And when African people move away from that, Kanban argues that that's a reflection of cultural misorientation, which we introduced, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Other manifestations of the African worldview among Africans in America include rhythm, dance, song. So we know the African people are very rhythmic. That's it. We deal with rhythm in every activity. If I were to clap, you should be able to repeat that quite comfortably as an African person. African people deal with rhythm and music and how we work, play, in religious activities and relaxation. And we can see the pounding of the yam in Africa that is done rhythmically. When people are catching fish, it's done rhythmically. When we are gathering, there's music. We sing in church and religious environments. So that singing, that rhythm, that soul is what brings the spirit of the energy into whatever the event is. So that's used for basic self-expression, such as even speech and gesturing. African people are very expressive. So we move our hands and are expressive in speech as well. There's also shared participation, and this other component emphasizes a call and response nature between the actor and the audience. An African way of being, African people communicate through interactive call and response. There's also a shared feeling of victory and or defeat whenever Black folks compete with whites in socially approved activities. There's a shared sense of, yes, we did it. And there's several recent examples of that. We also have social affiliative emphasis, where we tend to constantly form informal groupings, and we naturally strive for fellowship. So when we think about that, that's the folks who gather on the street corner, at the gas station, going to a party, hanging out in social places, because there's a need for, from the African worldview perspective, collective affirmation. It is a reduction on the emphasis of individualism, but we again want to have parties, hang out on a street corner, kickbacks, informal groupings where that it affirms the African cultural identity, again, over that individualism. We also have this notion of time. And I will ask for you, when we think about time, if the party starts at 10 o'clock, if the event or the party starts at 10 o'clock, what time do you get there? All right. That's because time is driven more by people. All right. So just the answer would be what? I would say 11:30. If you come too far past that hour, then it's a problem. But we know that for African people, time recognition is driven by people and activities and events, but not the clock, the time on the clock. In other cultures, you arrive 15 minutes ahead of time and wait to start. On time, African people start the party when the people get there. That is that African phenomenal time. And phenomenal time is just another manifestation of African worldview among Africans in America. So Baba Wade Nobles shares with us. So make sure you think of those different examples and how they manifest in your life. And it's important to understand how we express ourselves inside African worldview, and understand that any substantive deviation from operating inside an African worldview perspective is considered cultural misorientation or some issues with disordered behavior. So Wade Nobles also identified, in addition to Kanban and other theorists, identified a model of culture. And this model of culture emphasizes these various components of worldview. It represents an African-centered model of culture that encompasses a systematic view of these conceptual components of the worldview construct. So Baba Wade Nobles talks about there being these different levels of culture, and he identified 3 levels: surface level manifestations of culture, deeper level aspects of culture, and deeper level of cultural factors. So these 3 are tri-level. If we deal with surface manifestations, I'll just give this one example. If we know about African spirituality, for example, we might just know that that's a thing. There's this idea of African spirituality. Sure, there's some gods and deities. Okay. A deeper level aspect of culture might then get you to connect to being able to pour libation, for example, in the language of the culture. Even that second level, understand at a slightly deeper level the specific deities. And an even deeper level cultural factor may be getting a reading or divination that allows for you to understand what god or deity is specifically connected to you, while understanding more deeply the aspect of that particular god or deity that is closely connected to you. So we have this model actually similar to, which we don't address in this course, Marimba Ani's discussion on Beni So Giri So Dai, the forward, backward, the clear word. And that was important because we have different theorists who talk about how we get to cultural deep structure. How do we get deep into African culture as a way of understanding and viewing the world? So, worldview paradigm, or the Afrocentric worldview paradigm, is important, and these are some 4 basic features. 1, it generates a construction of African social reality from the framework of history, culture, and philosophy of African civilizations. Second feature of the Afrocentric paradigm is that it recognizes and articulates a basic continuity of the African worldview throughout the diverse populations around the globe. And what this is speaking to essentially is that African people are African people wherever they are in the world. The basic continuity means you can be in Africa and see someone pour a libation. You can go to Cuba and see someone pouring a libation at a shrine, just like you can go to Los Angeles and see somebody pour out a little bit of liquor for their dead homies. That is the basic continuity of the African worldview. African people are African and do African things everywhere in the world. Again, we have to also, with number 1, take into account history, culture, and the philosophy of African civilizations, because African civilizations have history, culture, and philosophy, and that plays a part in this Afrocentric paradigm. Third, we recognize and articulate the basic distinctness and independence of the African worldview relative to any other, such as the European worldview. We've argued earlier that the African worldview is distinctly different from the European worldview, and that comes from what Diop identified as that 2 cradle theory. The Southern cradles had more of a moral basis. Kanban argues that they emphasize spiritualism or spirituality over materialism, and that's reflected in the differences in the worldview. But most importantly, that African people have a unique way of seeing, viewing, and understanding and interpreting and engaging in the world, and that view is specific and unique to African people. Fourth, it projects an African survival thrust as the center of African social reality. In normal natural conditions, African people should be emphasizing the African survival thrust, what it means to allow for the continuance of African people, African race, African social reality. And that begins with understanding an African worldview, being able to understand how African people view the world, and understand all of the other features of the Afrocentric paradigm. So in order to assess worldview, there's a worldview scale that deals with, is a 26-item questionnaire that asks or assesses if you're if you're more of a spiritualist or a materialist. Ooh, that was hard. If you're more in harmony with nature or more antagonistic and seek for control over nature. If you're more collective or if you're more individualistic. And these are still very key criteria from the African worldview versus the European worldview. If you have a strong religious orientation versus a weak religious orientation. If you emphasize interdependence or separateness, synthesis or dichotomy. So when we deal with synthesis and dichotomy, we have dichotomy being either or, synthesis emphasizing, the screen just moved, both and, humanism, seeing all people as human, and racialism that shows emphasizes race or differences between races. So if you can find the worldview scale and take it, you can assess or evaluate yourself based on if you fit inside African worldview or lean more towards European worldview. Again, have shared before that African people have been conceptually incarcerated by the European worldview orientation. That means African people struggle with thinking inside their African mind, seeing what things of beauty being that of African, I don't know, dark skin, nappy hair, kinky curly hair, nice beautiful thick lips, round derriere. That's a conceptual incarceration when you bleach your skin. That means you think that something else is beautiful other than how you came out of the womb. Straightening the hair or wearing wigs, that is an incarceration, a conceptual incarceration. So African people have to step out of that conceptual incarceration. And worldview paradigm lies at the very core. How you see the world, how you understand yourself in the world is important. Miseducation manifests itself in Eurocentric conceptual incarceration. So African people struggle with seeing who African people are because they have been conceptually incarcerated. So we must challenge those things, try to think outside of these Eurocentric conceptualizations to understand that being African is beautiful, being black is beautiful, being black,